The key lay on Clara's doorstep, black as night and warm as a living thing, whispering her name in the stillness of the fog. The fog rolled in from the sea like a living thing, curling around the narrow streets of Saltmere with fingers of mist that seemed to search for something. Clara Whitmore pressed her face to the window of her locksmith shop, watching the vapor swirl past the amber streetlights. The town had been shrouded for 3 days now, and the locals whispered that such weather meant the sea was restless, stirring up old secrets from its depths. She turned back to her workbench, where a collection of antique locks waited for her careful attention. Clara had inherited the shop from her grandmother, along with the gift for understanding the language of tumblers and springs. Her fingers could read the story of any lock who had made it, what it had protected, sometimes even why it had been abandoned. But tonight, something felt different. The very air seemed to hum with an electric anticipation that made her skin prickle. The bell above her door chimed, though she had locked it hours ago. Clara looked up sharply, but saw only the fog pressing against the glass like a curious animal. She set down her tools and walked to the door. Her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet her grandmother had laid down decades ago. The brass handle was cold beneath her palm, and when she turned it, the door swung open with a soft whisper. There, on the worn stone threshold, lay a key unlike any she had ever seen. It was carved from what appeared to be obsidian, black as the space between stars, with intricate spirals etched along its length. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had been resting in sunlight rather than lying on cold stone in the heart of a fog-bound night. Clara lifted it carefully, feeling its weight heavier than any key had a right to be, as if it contained more than mere metal. The moment her fingers closed around it, a shiver ran through her hand and up her arm. The key pulsed with a gentle heat, like a heartbeat made of warmth. She held it up to the light, studying the craftsmanship. The spirals seemed to move in her peripheral vision, twisting and flowing like smoke frozen in stone. At the key's head, a small symbol was carved, a lighthouse surrounded by waves, so detailed she could almost hear the crash of surf against rocks. Clara retreated into her shop, locking the door behind her. She set the key on her workbench and stared at it, wondering who could have left such a thing. The town of Saltmere was small, and she knew every soul who might need her services. This key belonged to no lock she had ever seen, and yet something about it called to her with an urgency that made her fingers tremble. She tried to focus on her work, but the key seemed to draw her attention like a magnet. Each time she glanced at it, the spirals appeared to have shifted slightly, as if the key were slowly turning itself. The warmth it radiated grew stronger as the night deepened, and Clara found herself reaching for it again and again, drawn by its strange allure. The lighthouse, the symbol carved into the key's head, was undeniably the old Saltmere light, which had stood abandoned on the rocky point for nearly 30 years. Clara had passed it countless times during her evening walks, its windows dark and its door sealed. With rust, local children claimed it was haunted, but Clara had never given credence to such tales. Now, however, she found herself thinking of its lonely silhouette against the night sky. As midnight approached, the fog began to thin, revealing patches of star-studded darkness. Clara locked her shop and stepped into the night, the obsidian key clutched tightly in her palm. Its warmth spread through her fingers like a gentle fever, and she felt herself drawn toward the coastal path that led to the lighthouse. The cobblestones were slick with moisture, and her footsteps echoed softly in the mist. The lighthouse stood at the end of a narrow spit of land, its white tower ghostly pale against the dark sky. Clara had expected to find it, as she always had, locked and forgotten, claimed by time and salt air. But as she approached, she noticed something that made her heart skip. There, at the base of the tower, was a small iron lockbox she had never seen before. It was old, its surface pitted with rust, and in its center was a keyhole that seemed to match the obsidian key perfectly. Clara knelt beside the box, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The key grew warmer in her hand, almost eager, as if it recognized its purpose. She hesitated for a moment, remembering her grandmother's warnings about things that called to you in the night. But the pull was too strong, the mystery too compelling. She slid the key into the lock, and it turned with a soft click that seemed to echo across the water. The lockbox opened with a sigh, as if it had been holding its breath for decades. Inside, Clara found a collection of objects that made no immediate sense. A piece of sea glass worn smooth by the waves, a brass compass with a cracked face, and a small leather journal bound with a ribbon that had once been red but had faded to the color of dried blood. But it was the pulse of heat that erupted from the box that truly caught her attention. The warmth rushed up her arms like liquid fire, and Clara gasped as a burning sensation spread across her palm. She looked down to see a spiral mark appearing on her skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. The pattern matched the etchings on the key, and as she watched, it seemed to burrow deeper into her flesh, becoming part of her in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. The fog swirled around her with renewed intensity, and Clara heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices calling her name from somewhere out on the dark water. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but they grew clearer with each passing moment. "Clara," they whispered. "Clara, you've found us at last." She slammed the lockbox shut and staggered to her feet, the key still clutched in her burning palm. The voices continued to call, and she could see shapes moving in the fog offshore, the outline of a ship that seemed to flicker between existence and memory. Clara turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the rocky path as she fled back toward the safety of her shop. But even as she reached the familiar streets of Saltmere, the mark on her palm continued to burn, and the voices followed her on the wind. She fumbled with her shop key, her hands shaking as she unlocked the door and stumbled inside. The obsidian key was still warm in her palm, and when she set it on the workbench, she realized with growing horror that she could not let it go. Her fingers seemed fused to its surface, and the spiral mark on her palm pulsed with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. Clara sank into her chair and stared at the key, knowing that her life had changed forever. The voices were quieter now, but they had not gone away. They whispered promises and threats in equal measure, telling her of things lost to the sea and secrets that lay buried beneath the waves. And somewhere in the darkness of her shop, she could swear she heard the distant sound of waves crashing against rocks, though the ocean was half a mile away. The key that burned at midnight had found its keeper, and Clara Whitmore began to understand that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Dawn came to Saltmere with the pale reluctance of a dying candle, the fog having lifted just enough to reveal the gray line where sea met sky. Clara had not slept. She sat at her workbench, staring at the obsidian key that had somehow detached itself from her palm sometime during the long night. The spiral mark remained, etched into her skin like a brand, its edges still warm to the touch. She had tried everything to remove the key from her possession. She had locked it in her strongest safe, only to find it waiting on her pillow when she turned away. She had thrown it into the harbor from her shop's back window, watching it disappear into the dark water, only to discover it on her doorstep again at first light. The key wanted to be with her, and Clara was beginning to understand that her wants no longer mattered in this equation. The morning brought her first customer, Mrs. Henley, clutching a broken padlock and wearing the worried expression of someone who had locked herself out of her own garden shed. Clara took the lock with hands that trembled slightly, and the moment her fingers made contact with the metal, both women gasped. The padlock began to glow with a soft amber light, its inner mechanisms clicking and whirring as if alive. "Good heavens," Mrs. Henley whispered, backing toward the door. "What's happened to you, dear?" Clara stared at the lock in her hands, watching as the tumblers aligned themselves without her touching them. The padlock opened with a gentle snap, its shackle springing free. She had always been skilled with locks, but this was something else entirely. This was power, and it frightened her more than she cared to admit. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henley," Clara stammered, setting the lock on the counter. "I haven't been sleeping well. Please, take it. No charge." The older woman gathered her padlock with obvious haste, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. "You looked fevered, child. Perhaps you should see Dr. Morrison." She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. "And Clara, stay away from the lighthouse. The old-timers say it's been restless these past few nights." After Mrs. Henley left, Clara examined her reflection in the small mirror she kept beside her workbench. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes held a luminous quality that hadn't been there before. The spiral mark on her palm seemed to pulse with its own light, and she could feel it spreading, thin tendrils of warmth creeping up her wrist like living vines. The journal from the lockbox lay open beside her, its pages filled with entries written in a careful, feminine hand. Clara had been reading it throughout the night, piecing together the story of one Eleanor Blackwood, keeper of the Saltmere Light in the 1890s. Eleanor had written of strange visitors who came to the lighthouse on foggy nights, of ships that appeared and vanished without explanation, and of a key that had been given to her by a dying sailor. The key burns in my hand, Eleanor had written, and I fear I understand its purpose at last. The meridian was not lost to the storm, as the town believes. It was taken, pulled down into the depths by something that hungers for the light. The crew calls to me now, their voices carried on the wind. They say I must join them, that the lighthouse keeper's duty extends beyond the grave. But I am not ready to leave this world, not yet. Clara turned the page and found Eleanor's final entry, dated 3 days before the lighthouse was officially abandoned. The mark has spread to my shoulder now, and I can feel it reaching for my heart. The key will not stay hidden, no matter where I place it. It returns to me like a faithful dog, warm and patient and terrible. I have tried to destroy it, but obsidian forged in the depths of the sea cannot be broken by mortal hands. Tonight, I will do what I should have done from the beginning. I will return the key to the lockbox and seal it with my own blood. Perhaps that will be enough to keep it sleeping until another fool comes to wake it. Asterisk, Clara closed the journal. With shaking hands, Eleanor had failed, obviously, because the key had found its way to her. But there was something else in those pages, a hint of knowledge that made Clara's skin crawl. The Meridian, she had heard that name before, whispered in the tales her grandmother used to tell on stormy nights. A merchant ship that had vanished, without a trace, taking with it a cargo of rare minerals and a crew of 23 souls. The bell above her door chimed again, and Clara looked up to see a man she didn't recognize standing in her shop. He was tall and thin, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years at sea. His clothes were damp, as if he had been walking through the fog, and his eyes held a luminous quality that reminded her uncomfortably of her own reflection. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone from the northern islands. "I understand you've come into possession of something that belongs to me." Clara's hand moved instinctively to the obsidian key, which had appeared on her workbench, again despite her having locked it away. "I don't know what you mean." The man smiled, and Clara noticed that his teeth were stained with salt. "The key, Miss Whitmore, the one that burns with the light of the depths. It has a purpose, and that purpose is nearly fulfilled." "I don't want it," Clara said, backing toward the rear of her shop. "I never asked for any of this." "None of us did," the man replied, stepping closer. "But the sea takes what it needs and gives back what it must. You've been chosen, Miss Whitmore, just as Eleanor was chosen before you. The Meridian has been waiting a very long time to come home." Clara's back hit the wall, and she felt the spiral mark on her palm flare with sudden heat. The Meridian was lost in a storm. Everyone knows that. Lost, yes, the man agreed, but not to any storm that belongs to this world. It was pulled down into the dark places where the old things sleep and dream. The crew thought they were dying, but death would have been a kindness. Instead, they became something else, something that exists between the waves and the void. The man reached into his coat and produced a compass identical to the one Clara had found in the lockbox. Its needle spun wildly, never settling on any direction that made sense. "They've been calling to every keeper of the light for 30 years, waiting for one strong enough to answer." Eleanor was close, but she fought the change. "You, I think, will be more accommodating." "I won't," Clara said, but even as she spoke, she could feel the mark on her palm responding to the man's presence. The warmth was spreading faster now, creeping up her arm like tide water. "I don't know what you are, but I won't be part of this." The man's smile widened, and Clara saw that his eyes were the color of deep water. "You don't have a choice, Miss Whitmore. The key has marked you, and the crew of the Meridian grows impatient. They've been waiting so long to return to the surface, to feel the light on their faces again. You're going to help them, and if I refuse, then the mark will consume you, and we'll find another keeper. But I don't think you'll refuse. The key chose you for a reason, and deep down, you can feel it calling to you. The sea is in your blood now, Miss Whitmore. It's only a matter of time before you answer its call." The man turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing. The lighthouse will be lit again tonight, whether you will it or not. The crew has waited long enough, and the tide is turning. I suggest you be there to greet them properly." After he left, Clara sank to her knees, clutching her burning palm. The mark had spread to her wrist now, and she could feel it pulsing with a rhythm that matched the distant sound of waves. She thought of Eleanor's journal, of the woman's desperate attempts to resist the key's influence, and wondered if she would have any more success. The obsidian key lay on her workbench, waiting, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Clara picked it up, feeling its familiar warmth, and knew that tonight she would return to the lighthouse. Not because she wanted to, but because she no longer had the strength to resist. The key that burned at midnight had found its keeper, and the sea was calling its children Hotha. Afternoon brought a strange stillness to Saltmere, as if the very air was holding its breath. Clara sat in her shop, watching the mark on her palm spread with inexorable persistence. The spiral pattern had reached her elbow now, and she could feel it pulsing with each beat of her heart. Every lock in her shop had begun to glow with the same amber light, responding to her presence, like flowers turning toward the sun. She had tried to research the meridian, but the town's records were frustratingly vague. The ship had vanished during the winter of 1893, somewhere off the coast during a fierce storm. 23 souls lost, the newspapers had reported, including the captain and his young wife. But there was something else, a detail that had been carefully omitted from the official reports. Clara found it in her grandmother's private papers, tucked away in a folder marked Things the Town Forgot. The Meridian had been carrying more than just trade goods. In its hold were 3 crates of rare minerals, mined from the deepest trenches of the ocean floor. The cargo manifest listed them only as specimens for the university, but Clara's grandmother had written notes in the margins. Notes that spoke of stones that glowed with their own light and metals that sang when touched. The kind of things that should have stayed buried in the depths as evening approached. Clara found herself drawn to the lighthouse, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away. The obsidian key had fused itself to her palm again, its warmth spreading through her entire body like a fever. She could hear the voices more clearly now, calling her name from somewhere beyond the fog that had begun to roll in from the sea. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its white tower looking more like a bone than stone. Clara approached slowly, her footsteps echoing off the rocky path. The lockbox was still there, sitting open beside the tower's base, and she could see that the items inside were glowing with the same amber light that now emanated from her marked palm. But it was the lighthouse itself that made her breath catch. The windows that had been dark for 30 years were now filled with a soft, pulsing light. Not the steady beam of a working lighthouse, but something that flickered and danced like trapped lightning. Clara could see a figure moving in the lamp, room at the top of the tower, a silhouette that seemed to beckon her forward. The door to the lighthouse stood open, creaking softly in the wind. Clara hesitated at the threshold, remembering Eleanor's warnings from the journal, but the mark on her palm flared with sudden heat, and she found herself stepping inside despite her fears. The interior was not as she had expected. Instead of the dusty, abandoned rooms she had imagined, the lighthouse was alive with activity. Phantoms moved through the spiral staircase, their forms shifting between solid and translucent. They wore the clothes of sailors from another era, their faces bearing the luminous quality of those who had spent too long beneath the waves. Clara began to climb the stairs, her hand trailing along the iron railing. With each step, the mark on her palm grew warmer, and she could feel the presence of the crew more clearly. They were not ghosts, she realized, but something else entirely. They existed in the spaces between worlds, neither fully alive nor completely dead, sustained by the strange power that had pulled their ship into the depths. The lamp room at the top of the tower was a marvel of impossible engineering. The light that should have been housed there had been replaced by something that hurt to look at directly, a swirling vortex of luminous water that seemed to contain the entire ocean. Clara could see shapes moving within it, the ghostly outline of a ship resting on the bottom of the sea. "You came," said a voice behind her. Clara turned to see a woman in a keeper's uniform, her face pale but determined. It was Eleanor Blackwood, or what remained of her. The former lighthouse keeper stood at the top of the stairs, her hands glowing, with the same marks that now covered Clara's arm. "I tried to resist," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the sound of distant waves. "I thought I could fight the key's influence, keep it locked away until someone stronger came along. But you can't fight the sea, Clara. It takes what it needs and gives back what it must." "What happened to the Meridian?" Clara asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. "They dug too deep," Eleanor replied. "The minerals they brought up from the ocean floor were not meant for the surface world. They were eggs, in a sense, seeds of something that had slept in the depths for millions of years. When the storm came, it wasn't wind and rain that pulled the ship down. It was the awakening of something vast and hungry, swirling vortex, and saw the truth. The crew of the Meridian had not drowned. They had been transformed, made into servants of whatever dwelt in the deepest trenches. For 30 years, they had been trying to return to the surface, to bring their master's influence to the world above. All they needed was a beacon, a lighthouse, to guide them home. "And that's where we come in," Clara said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "The key chooses its keeper," Eleanor confirmed. "Someone with the gift to work with locks and doors, to open the pathways between worlds. I held them back for as long as I could, but the mark was consuming me. To find a successor before it was too late." "You left the key for me," Clara realized. "You brought it to my shop. I had to. The alternative was worse. If the key had no keeper, the crew would have found another way to the surface. At least this way, there's still a chance to control what happens next." Palm pulse with sudden urgency. The vortex in the lamp room was beginning to spin faster, and she could see the ghostly outline of the Meridian rising from the depths. The crew was coming home, whether she willed it or not. "What do I have to do?" Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You have to choose. You can resist, as I did, and let the mark consume you slowly, or you can embrace the change, become what the key wants you to be. Either way, the Meridian will reach the surface. But if you accept your role as keeper, you might be able to guide them, to keep their hunger from consuming the town." Clara looked down at her hand, where the obsidian key had become part of her flesh. The spiral mark was spreading across her chest now, reaching for her heart. She could feel her humanity slipping away, replaced by something older and stranger. But she could also feel the crew's desperate need. their longing to return to the light after 30 years in the dark. "If I do this," Clara said slowly, "what happens to me?" "You become the lighthouse keeper," Eleanor replied. "Guardian of the boundary between worlds. It's not the life you would have chosen, but it's the one you're needed for. Patient, but it won't wait much longer." The vortex in the lamp room pulsed with blinding light, and Clara saw the meridian break the surface of the water far below. The ghostly ship rode the waves like a living thing, its sails billowing with wind that came from no earthly source. On its deck, she could see the crew watching the lighthouse with eyes that glowed like stars. Clara closed her eyes and let the transformation complete itself. The mark spread across her heart, and she felt her connection to the human world fade like a distant memory. When she opened her eyes again, they held the same luminous quality as Eleanor's, and she understood her purpose at last. She was the lighthouse keeper now, guardian of the beacon that would guide the lost souls home. The obsidian key had found its rightful keeper, and the sea had claimed another daughter. But as Clara watched the meridian approach the shore, she wondered if she had made the right choice, or if she had simply become part of something too vast and ancient to resist. The key that burned at midnight had done its work, and the deep places of the ocean were stirring with new Eltha. Meridian glided through the fog-shrouded waters with the grace of a vessel that had learned to navigate between worlds. Clara stood in the lamp room, her body now fully transformed by the obsidian key's power, watching the ghostly ship approach the rocky shore below. The mark had spread across her entire torso, forming intricate patterns that pulsed with the rhythm of the tides. She was no longer entirely human, but something caught between the world of the living and the realm of the depths. Eleanor stood beside her, a sad smile playing across her luminous features. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying the sound of waves against stone. To see them finally coming home after so many years lost in the dark. Clara nodded, though she wasn't certain beautiful was the word she would choose. The meridian was magnificent in its way, but there was something unsettling about its appearance. The ship's hull gleamed with a phosphorescent sheen that seemed to come from within, and its sails billowed with wind that carried the scent of deep ocean trenches. The crew moved about its deck with purpose, but their movements were too fluid, too graceful for ordinary sailors. "What are they now?" Clara asked, her voice already beginning to take on the distant quality she had heard in Ella. "Something between what they were and what they needed to become," Eleanor replied. "The deep places changed them, gave them the ability to survive in the spaces between worlds. They're still human, in a way, but they're also something more, something that belongs to the sea." Clara watched as the meridian's anchor dropped into the shallow water near the lighthouse. The crew was preparing to come ashore, and she could feel their anticipation like a physical presence in the air. They had been waiting 30 years for this moment, 30 years to return to the surface and feel the light on their faces again. The first to step onto the rocky shore was a man Clara recognized from her earlier encounter, the stranger who had visited her shop. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted this moment would come, his feet finding purchase on the wet stones, as if he had walked this path 1,000 times before. "Captain Aldrich," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of both respect and wariness. He was the one who ordered the deep mining, the one who brought the cargo up from the trenches. He spent longer than any of them learning to navigate between worlds. The captain looked up at the lighthouse, his luminous eyes finding Clara in the lamp room. He raised his hand in greeting, and she felt compelled to respond, though she wasn't sure why. The connection between them was immediate and undeniable. Keeper to captain, lighthouse to ship, guardian to wanderer. One by one, the crew of the Meridian came ashore. Clara counted 23 souls, just as the old records had indicated. But there was something different about them now, something that made her skin crawl, even as she felt drawn to their presence. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had learned to swim through more than just water, and their skin held the same phosphorescent quality as their ship. "They're hungry," Eleanor warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for food, but for connection. They've been isolated for so long, existing in the spaces between worlds. They need to feel grounded again, to remember what it was like to be human." Clara watched as the crew began to explore the area around the lighthouse, their movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment. They touched the rocks, the scraggly grass, the weathered wood of the lighthouse itself, as if trying to absorb the essence of the solid world through their fingertips. "Is it safe?" Clara asked, thinking of the town sleeping peacefully in the distance. "That depends on you," Eleanor replied. "As the keeper, you have the power to guide them, to help them remember their humanity. But if you can't control them, if their hunger becomes too strong..." She trailed off, but Clara understood the implication. Captain Aldrich began to climb the lighthouse stairs, his footsteps echoing in the spiral chamber. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness as he approached, but the mark on her chest pulsed with warm reassurance. She was the keeper now, and he was bound to respect her authority. "Miss Whitmore," he said as he entered the lamp room, "I trust the transformation wasn't too difficult." "Difficult enough," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What happens now?" "Now we begin the real work," the captain said, moving to stand beside the swirling vortex that served as the lighthouse's beacon. "The deep places are stirring, awakening from their long slumber. The minerals we brought up from the trenches 30 years ago were just the beginning. There are others down there, things that have been waiting for the right moment to return to the surface." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Return to the surface, for what purpose? "To reclaim what was once theirs," the captain replied. "Long before your kind walked the earth, the deep places were part of this world. They were driven down by ice and fire, forced to slumber in the trenches while the surface world developed its own life. But they never forgot, never stopped dreaming of the light. And you're their servants now," Clara said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "We're their heralds," the captain corrected. "Their advanced scouts, if you will. We've spent 30 years learning to navigate between worlds, preparing for their return. The lighthouse is just the first step. Soon there will be other beacons along every coast, keepers in every port town. The deep places will rise again, and the surface world will remember what it means to belong to the sea." Clara looked down at the crew gathered around the lighthouse, their luminous forms moving with purpose through the fog. She could feel their hunger, their desperate need to reconnect with the solid world. But she could also sense something else of vast intelligence pressing against the boundaries of her consciousness, something that watched and waited in the deepest trenches of the ocean. "What do you need from me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Your acceptance, the captain replied. Your willingness to serve as the bridge between worlds. The deep places need someone who understands both the human realm and the realm of the depths. Someone who can guide the transition, make it as smooth as possible. Clara closed her eyes and felt the weight of the choice before her. She could resist, as Eleanor had tried to do, and fight against the transformation that was already consuming her. But she could also embrace her role as keeper, accept the responsibility that came with the Obsidian Key's power. The town, she said finally, the people of Saltmere, they'll be changed as you were changed, the captain replied. Not all at once, but gradually. The deep places are patient. They've waited millions of years. They can wait a little longer to reclaim their rightful place in the world. Clara opened her eyes and looked out at the fog-shrouded town in the distance. She thought of Mrs. Henley and Dr. Morrison, of all the ordinary people who had no idea their world was about to change forever. She thought of her grandmother, who had left her the locksmith shop and the gift for understanding the language of locks and keys. And if I refuse, then the transition will be more difficult, the captain said. The deep places will find another way to the surface, and the change will be violent rather than gradual. You have the power to guide them, Miss Whitmore, to help them remember their connection to the human world. Without that guidance, they'll simply take what they need. Clara felt the mark on her chest pulse with warm encouragement. The Obsidian Key had chosen her for a reason, and she was beginning to understand what that reason was. She was the bridge between worlds, the keeper of the balance between the surface and the depths. It was a responsibility she had never asked for, but one that had been thrust upon her nonetheless. I'll do it, she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. I'll serve as keeper, guide the transition as best I can, but I have conditions. The captain smiled, and Clara saw genuine warmth in his luminous eyes. Name them. The change must be gradual, she said. No sudden transformations, no violence against the innocent. The people of Saltmere will be given time to adjust, to understand what's happening to them. Agreed, the captain said. Anything else? I want to understand, Clara said. I want to know what the deep places really are, what they want from this world. If I'm going to serve as their herald, I need to know what I'm heralding. The captain nodded and gestured toward the swirling vortex in the center of the lamp room. Then come, he said. Let me show you the true nature of the depths, the realm that waits beneath the waves. Once you understand, you'll see that the return of the deep places is not an invasion, but a homecoming. Clara stepped toward the vortex, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The key that burned at midnight had brought her to this moment, and she was about to discover what lay at the heart of its power de vue. The vortex pulled Clara into its swirling depths with the gentleness of a mother's embrace. She felt herself dissolving, becoming part of the luminous water that connected the lighthouse to the deepest trenches of the ocean. The sensation was neither painful nor frightening, but rather like remembering a dream she had forgotten upon waking. Around her, the boundaries between water and space, between depth and height, began to blur. Clara found herself swimming through liquid starlight, her transformed body moving with the same fluid grace she had observed in the crew of the Meridian. The mark on her chest glowed like a beacon, guiding her through the impossible geography. Of the deep places, Captain Aldrich swam beside her, his form shifting between human and something more aquatic with each stroke. The deep places are not what your kind imagines, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the luminous water. They are not dark, lifeless trenches, but gardens of impossible beauty, cities of coral and crystal, populated by beings that have existed since the world was young. Clara saw the truth of his words as they descended further into the depths. The ocean floor here was alive with phosphorescent gardens, their tendrils swaying in currents that carried the songs of creatures. She had no names for vast structures rose from the seabed, their architecture following principles that human minds had never conceived. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure, speaking of intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. Long before the first humans walked the earth, Captain Aldrich continued, the deep places were part of the surface world.